Good morning, everybody. In our two-day event where we want to talk and learn about the involvement of farmers in the implementation and development of the national pathways. My name is Martina Fleckenstein. I will moderate the session today. I'm with WWF International, leading on our policy work of our food program. And I'm currently in Rome attending the UN Food System Summit, Stocktake. It's the +2. And we had really very inspiring and interesting discussion, listening what has happened in the last 2 years. And there is a critical discussion also on the involvement of all stakeholders in the process of the transformation of food system. And it's especially on the implementation. We talk about the implementation of the national pathways, and especially a successful implementation can only be achieved if we actively listen to the voices of all people, and in particular to the farmers and the fisher folks. And that's the topic of our event today. And before we go in the panel discussion, we would like to learn a little bit more who is in this session, who is participating. And we would like to hear a little bit of your perception and experience on your involvement, on farmers' involvement, and also how you feel to influence policy processes and policy reforms. You will see in a minute in the chat the Mentipoll and the link to the Mentimeter. It's here now. And we would really like to encourage you to go on the Mentipoll and to answer the questions. We will leave the poll open during the whole session. So even if you participate later, it would be great if you could share your thoughts with us. And we are really interested to get your input. Having said this, and being here in Rome, there is also the perception that we have huge gaps. We still have gaps in the ambition, in the transformation, and in the implementation of a food systems transformation on the way to a sustainable food system. We need, and that's also emphasized here, we really need concrete actions on the ground to especially address the triple challenge which we have. And this is on food and nutrition security. It's on climate change, mitigation and adaptation actions, and it's on biodiversity conservation. And we need to bridge the existing gap between this current situation and the country's ambitions in the national pathways, but also the country's ambitions, which we see in the implementation of the UN Convention, of the UNFCCC, the Climate Convention with their NDCs, their National Determined Contribution, with the Biodiversity Convention and the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans. And finally, with the Land Convention, the UNCCD, where we have the commitment on restoration. And to fulfill this, it's important to involve farmers in the design and the implementation of national pathways, and especially of these processes. And in the event today, and we are really, it's very early morning, so great to see you. For some of you, it's afternoon for the other parts of the world. And in this event, we brought together a representative from regional farmers organization. We have international initiatives, and we have also government representatives. And we want to discuss what does it mean if we talk about the just transition of sustainable food system, and especially learn about the experience in the implementation and development of the national pathways. We want to keep this session also interactive, and we want to encourage you to put the Q&A in the Q&A box. After the panel discussion, we will have time to answer your questions, and happy to get a lot of questions and responses from the participants. I would like now start with introduce my first panelist, Aaron Etheridge. Aaron is the Senior Technical Advisor of Just Rural Transition, and he supports the Just Rural Transition synthesis work on what a just transition means for food system. And he has recently was involved in a report on the principles for just food system transition. Aaron, very welcome to our discussion today. Happy to have you in the call. And I really would like to learn a little bit and to hear your thoughts on what kind of outcomes can we achieve through a participatory and inclusive process? And what are the essential characteristics of this process? And this refers also to the result of your report. Over to you to give your insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina, and hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. Yeah, so what kind of outcomes are we aiming for? I think that's a good place to start a discussion about stakeholder engagement, because if we're going to talk about participation and inclusion in national pathways or in other food system interventions, then it's good to understand the outcomes we want, and also to understand the secondary impacts of the change process itself, to be clear about those, because that will help us to clarify who should be engaged during the planning process for a more sustainable, resilient, equitable food system. The Just Rural Transition recently published a paper that outlines 10 principles for a just food system transition, and maybe Holly can share the link in the chat with you. There are several principles there that focus on where we need food systems to be. So that is what kind of change we need to see across the food system as a whole, in production, in distribution, even on the consumption side. So if we want to talk about what a just food system looks like, so sort of the outcome of the change process itself, then we're talking about things like a food system that meets everyone's nutritional needs, noting today that, you know, hunger, malnutrition, food insecurity are still pervasive. And in fact, there's upward trends in some of those. The food system has to operate within planetary boundaries, which means we're talking about not only carbon emissions, the contribution to climate change, but also impacts on biodiversity, on the nitrogen cycle, on freshwater withdrawals, sort of the global environmental impacts of the food system. But also the food system has to provide good, decent livelihoods. And that's so critical because there are, you know, more than a quarter of the global workforce is in agriculture today. We're talking about billions of livelihoods that are in some way connected with food production. So a future food system, a just food system, has to somehow maintain a lot of those livelihoods. But the food system then also has to protect the rights of people. It has to protect the welfare of animals. It needs to be resilient to climate change. It needs to be sort of reversing some of the environmental degradation that's today's food system has created, things like deforestation, water pollution, because these affect local communities unjustly. And it needs to be reversing some of the power imbalances that you see in today's food system, for instance, between smallholder farmers and large agribusiness. So obviously achieving that kind of vision, if that's the outcome of the change process itself, achieving that kind of vision requires pretty significant structural changes across the food system. And while those changes should deliver net positive benefits at the level of society, there will be, you know, certain stakeholders might experience costs, risks, disruption to livelihood as a result of the change process. So farmers who can't afford to change production systems, for instance, could be left behind as the market shifts away from old production methods. So the just transition concept then, which we talk about in this paper, it's about not ignoring these impacts, but actually trying to address them in a way so that the costs and benefits of change are sort of fairly distributed. They shouldn't be concentrated on smallholder farmers, on farm workers, on rural communities. They shouldn't be bearing most of the costs of us changing the global food system to a more sustainable system. So the rest of the principles in that paper then are about the actual process of change. Basically, it boils down to two things. First, we have to make sure we understand the way that the risks and costs associated with these changes are distributed and ensure that we manage them fairly. And secondly, and importantly for this particular discussion, is that the process for planning and implementing these changes must be socially inclusive. So that means all stakeholders who might be affected are part of the planning process and are able to influence decisions and shape local development outcomes. So I think they're the first question you asked me there about the outcomes. I think that's perhaps what I would like to say on that. The second question you had was, I think, what are the essential characteristics of a participatory process then? Probably picking up on that last principle I mentioned. There's a couple of things here I would probably point to. One is the idea of procedural justice, which is a very key concept. Procedural justice means we have to focus not just on whether consultation or engagement happened, but on the actual form it takes. So it's about an inclusive process where a wide range of stakeholders are involved. And this goes beyond just engaging with those who might be usually involved in planning processes or have the loudest voices in influencing policy processes. Being very deliberate about acknowledging and bringing in marginalized groups, vulnerable groups to the process. And secondly, that they have to be able to engage in a meaningful way. So that means they have some degree of ownership and influence over the process. And there we're talking, for that to happen, then you need to start thinking about, being aware of unequal power relations between actors in the food system, and think about the capacity of the different stakeholders have to be able to engage. So that's procedural justice. And the other key concept, I think, when you talk about a participatory process is the issue of representation. So who represents different types of stakeholders? Smallholder farmers don't have the same, don't face the same risks or have the same coping mechanisms as big farmers, for instance. And farmer associations might represent some, but not other farmers. If you talk about informal workers, have a totally different exposure to risks and access to social protection systems than those that are formally employed in the food system. And labour unions might represent one group but not the other. The private sector is also very heterogeneous. So thinking about who represents private sector interests in an engagement process is key. So just lastly then, if you turn those around, if you take procedural justice and representation as key ideas and you turn them around into a set of questions to explore in an engagement process, for it to be socially inclusive, you would be asking who is included or represented in the project, what parameters do stakeholders have an influence over, and what capacity do stakeholders have to engage, and how might we be able to enhance their capacity through the engagement process? I'll leave it there, Martina, and pass it back to you.
Thanks, Aaron. I think it's very important for us to be clear, what does it mean if we want to have an inclusive process? And I think your principles for just food system transition is a very, very important report. And just to reiterate your three last points on the procedure justice, on the representation, who is involved in this development process. And I think especially the last one also, on creating capacity, building up knowledge, enabling people to participate in an adequate way is more than important. And I think, Irish, you probably will also have answers on this. Irish Baguila, you are the coordinator of the Asian Farmers Association for Sustainable Rural Development. And you also are coordinator of the UN Decade of Family Farmer and Women Farmers Agenda at Asian Farmers Association for Sustainable Rural Development. So you have a lot of experience working with the people on the ground, working with women, working with farmers. And we really want to listen to your experience of farmers' involvement and inclusion in the national pathways, but also maybe in other policy processes which are happening in your countries. And it would be good also if you have maybe some positive examples about national pathways and how farmers have been engaged in this process, and maybe even reflecting on what Aaron has said, if these principles are already considered or if there is a lot of room for improvement. Irish, over to you now.
Yes, thank you, Martina, and thank you to the organizers for inviting the Asian Farmers Association to be part of this dialogue and discussion, sharing of experiences. So, yeah, AFA, we have been part of, we have been involved in the pre-summit, summit processes. And so up until now, we are also engaging through the stakeholders engagement process of the hub. So when we checked among our members, so we have about 20 national farmers organization in 16 countries. So when we consulted and checked with our members who actually have been part of the national pathways development, and of our members, 3 has expressed that they were part of the process. So in the Philippines, our partners have responded that they were able to attend several meetings which have been convened, and that the discussion has been focusing on the socio-economic agenda, ensuring food security and proper nutrition. And in similarly in Southeast Asia, in Laos, our member, the Lao Farmer Network, was engaged by FAO. So it was FAO who actually brought in the different stakeholders, and our member was able to bring forward some of the crucial agenda, which is the protection of common resources, such as forest, and protection of agricultural land from being converted to other uses, and also promotion of farm diversification rather than monocropping, and increase in the market share of smallholder farmers. So these were the agenda that our member in Laos was able to brought forward during the consultation processes. And in India, our member, the Self-Employed Women's Association, because they were part also of the pre-summit processes until the Food System Summit, and even now, they were able to have a regular conversation with the conveners, in India, and even up until even post this Stocktaking, there will be there are already agreed ways forward where SEWA, our member, will be continuous part of the process of co-creating these national pathways. So yeah, in all our where we are, so 3 members were expressed that they were consulted. So I wanted to you ask about a good process where we were a part of, in the past. And I think this is something that we can actually draw a lot of lessons from. So since the decade of family farming was declared in 2018, we have been very active in mobilizing our members and even other stakeholders who are supporting family farmers. But it's not just in 2018 or 2019, but even during the International Year of Family Farming in 2014, we have been very active in mobilizing our members to take part in the development of the National Action Plan for Family Farming. And we were able to successfully influence the National Action Plan on Family Farming in 3 countries. So this is in the Philippines, Nepal, and Indonesia. So what are the enabling factors? So I think in the Philippines, I want to highlight is because the process has been institutionalized, So the participation of farmers, I mean, of course, aside from the focus, which is family farming, the participation of farmers' organization, of farmers, fishers, herders, is at the heart of the process. It was emphasized even at the global level, even within the global framework. And so when it was brought down at the national level, the multi-stakeholder platform requires the participation of different stakeholders. So in the Philippines, there was IFAD has been supporting every year the participation of farmers' organizations. So it has become a regular process. So I think that's one. There has to be some resources for the different stakeholders to actually come together. Of course, it's a different thing for the more resourced, no, or institutions with more resources. But for farmers, for other stakeholders, no, vulnerable groups, there has to be regular support for them to come together every year and actually influence the ongoing processes. So there's a regular engagement, and it's the same thing in Indonesia. Aside from the farmers' organization, they were able to get different agencies to support them. They were able to engage research institutions and other NGOs supporting family farmers so that they are accompanied to engage with the government. So these are some of the things that I think has enabled our participation. So there's resource, continuous engagement, institutionalization of this engagement process, and it has to be at the heart of the document or framework.
Thank you, Irish. And that's encouraging listening to you. And it seems like that even to connecting different processes with each other. So you mentioned you started with the decade of family farmers. So, and in the countries you mentioned, there is a kind of institutionalized process, and the national pathways or the implementation of the national pathways are linked and building on this process. I think this is also something that we get out of a siloed approach, to really have to bring these different approaches together. And I think you also mentioned a very important point, which is resources for the stakeholder, so that they are enabled to participate, but also I think there are travel costs to come to a meeting and all these things. So this is something where farmers need to support. And if we talk about implementation and integration in the development, we have also to think about this. And the third point, and I think that's also maybe the strength of this decade of family farming or other decades, is a continuous engagement. It's not starting and then ending, but it's something which goes over a longer period. And this is also something to strengthen in this process. And therefore, the national pathways and the other policy processes to connect and to link and to build on existing structures is more than important. Thank you. I will come now to my next panelist, Elizabeth Nisamadala. Elizabeth, you're from Uganda, and you are an agripreneur and a smallholder farmer. And you're also, and that's important, the president of the Eastern African Farmers Federation and African representative in the board of the World Farmers Organization. So you have both experience. You are leading on an organization, but at the same time, you are an agripreneur, you are a smallholder farmer, you're working on the ground, and we're really interested also to listen and to hear from your experience being involved in the national pathways, in the development, and maybe there was already some implementation and action happened. And if you have maybe any positive process, and also how you could explain a little bit how the engagement was in your country. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martina, and distinguished excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by, first of all, acknowledging and paying tribute to JRT for inviting the Eastern Africa Farmers Federation to be part of this dialogue. So just to pick it from where Eilish stopped, of course, us as a regional farm organization like AFA, I would like to state that we've also been part of the UN Food System Summit process. We were involved and we fully engaged in the independent dialogues in the pre-summit, but also during the summit. But one key thing that I want to point out is just post the summit. I think the momentum has really reduced, because post the summit, then the UNFSS coordination hub was put together. But as a regional farm organization, and not only just speaking as EF, but also when I look at Pan-Africa Farmers Organization, we really don't see a very critical role that we have to play when it comes to our engagement with the coordination hub, because most of their work is at national level, overseeing and coordinating, the implementation of the national pathways and the reporting mechanism. So it's more from national to the global level. And when you look at all these other structures, the regional, the continental ones, and institutions like African Union, we don't see really how they directly, interact with a coordination hub. So there's really some bit of a challenge, and I think it needs to be taken up so that it can be really addressed. So back to the national pathways. Yes, I would like to state that as farmers organizations at national level, most of our member organizations, they were involved, especially when it came to putting together the national pathways. But what happened, or what is happening currently when it comes to the implementation? I would like to state that it's more said than done. Yes, majority of the stakeholders really appreciate farmers' involvement, that it's very key. But when it comes to practicability in terms of the implementation, it's really lacking. Majority of the stakeholders, they really assume that they understand farmers' problems, but this is through a helicopter view. They look at agriculture as a routine work for us, and yet for us, it's a business. Yes, you're called, you're involved in the, putting together the national pathways and all that. But then when it comes to the implementation, we see less involvement of our farmers in the implementation process. Some countries in my region, when I talk of a country like Rwanda, for example, they involve farmers fully in consultations, but also in the implementation. In some cases, they have even gone a step further to use national farmers organizations as service providers. Institutions like Rwanda Youth in Agribusiness Forum, they're involved in issues of youth, in issues of innovation, technologies, extension. We have other members like Ingabo, Imbaraga, they're involved in some of the value chains that they are engaged in. But I want to say that this is just maybe one case among the many countries. So we really need to see other countries also, upping up their game to fully involve farmers in the implementation of the national pathways. There are some isolated cases of involvement. I would say it's there, but we really need to see how we can scale that and make sure that we improve and we involve farmers fully so that we can look at ourselves as equal partners. So when it comes to our involvement, yes, it's been there, but not to the level that we want it. But we have also involved ourselves in and led some processes that have been successful, especially the policy processes. Policy, lobby, and advocacy is a major thrust area of our strategic plan as the Eastern Africa Farmers Federation. And therefore, as an institution, we've really built enough capacity around it. And this is through the regional secretariat, but also our membership. We've identified different tools. For example, we've adopted the FACT methodology, the Farmers Advocacy Consultation Tool. This majority of you might know that it has been promoted by AgriTerra. So we also domesticated it to assist us in identifying some of the priority policy issues. So there are several examples where our member organizations have really taken lead in engaging with governments in policy processes. We've influenced several of them at national level, but also at subnational level. I want to point out cases in Uganda, for example, with the New Cafe during the coffee policy process, in Burundi through CAPAD's involvement with the national law, the cooperative national law of Burundi. But I want to highlight one regional experience with us, the Eastern Africa Farmers Federation, which is the East Africa Cooperative Societies Bill 2015, where as a regional organization, we took lead and championed the process of having a regional law to facilitate the regional integration. And this was out of a need by our membership. They believed in cooperatives as a special purpose vehicle for economic transformation. So how did our process or our experience look like? Of course, we held internal consultations with our membership. We conducted studies looking at the cooperative laws in the East Africa community countries, but also other countries like Ethiopia, like the UK, like India. We engaged with the East Africa Legislative Assembly Committee on Agriculture. We identified a champion to lead this process because we could not do it direct in the parliament. So we identified Honorable Michael Sebaru. By then, he was the member of parliament representing Uganda in Iyara. We partnered with other institutions like the cooperative, like Moshi University, and we had champions like the late Professor Chambo, who was a lecturer then at Moshi University, and he helped us in putting all these ideas together, plus other consultants. So we mobilized resources, of course, to facilitate the public consultations in all these partner countries. And we mobilized all the ministries, all the cooperative ministries, all the commissioners, the National Apex Organization, civil society organizations, international and national NGOs that are all working in cooperatives in our member states. We had to attend Iyara sessions when the law was tabled on the floor of parliament and the bill was passed in 2015. But by the time it was passed, Tanzania was the chair. Now, what has been the challenge? The challenge is that some of these policy processes are also hindered by other processes. At the time the bill was passed, Tanzania was going into elections, and we had the new president of Tanzania coming on board. So when the late Magufuli came on board, the process really stalled, and the bill could not be signed at that point. Much as we had mobilized other heads of states to assent to the bill, we could not get the bill out of Tanzania. So 8 years down the road, the bill has not been assented to. And we are currently pushing again to have the bill assented to. So we really need to, the experience is that what we've learned is that, we need champions, we need resources, we need people who understand the process, we need to involve our national farmers organizations, we need to strengthen capacity of the new leaders to lead the process, but also to understand that the policy process requires a full bottle of patience, because it's not, a give and take. It takes a long process. But also it requires that you are equipped with information. There's need for a lot of capacity building and, of course, resources and time. Thank you, and over to you, Martina.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting to listen your experience, and good to hear that you have been involved and that there is a discussion. But at the other hand, what I learned is that even there is a discussion, farmers are involved, the implementation is still lacking. And also, you mentioned that sometimes these processes, and you had this example with the bill, takes time. And my question, but we could ask this also in the chat, in the Q&A later, is how the national pathway process could strengthen maybe other ongoing policy processes. So maybe the development of the national determined contribution under the UNFCCC, or the example you mentioned with the bill, the farmers' bill. So how this all could get hand in hand. And this leads me to my next speaker, to Rachel. Rachel is from the UK government. And Rachel, you are the team leader on sustainable water and food systems, Climate and Environment Division in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of FCDO. And you have been deeply involved also in the co-presidency campaign 26. You are a member of the Just Rural Transition Working Group, and you're currently leading a project with World Bank where you also where you support the implementation of the national pathways to a just transition to sustainable food system. And it would be really interesting to hear from you, from a government, your experience in the policy dialogue series, in the feedback, what you hear from government, and how farmers are or could be involved in this process. So over to you, Rachel.
Great, thank you very much, Martina, and everybody. It's been really fascinating listening to the experience from Elizabeth and Irish so far, and from Aaron. Thank you. So just to explain a little bit, I guess we are let me take a step back. So from our international development perspective in the Climate and Environment Directorate, we're sort of looking at key entry points to food systems transformation. And we've sort of focused our engagement on through agriculture as kind of key entry point. And obviously farmers' perspectives are absolutely critical to this. So, I mean, governments, you know, we are very much aware, as Aaron set out at the beginning, that our current sort of production systems are, you know, not producing the outcomes that we want, although we are, you know, the world is producing a lot of food and more than we've ever produced, but actually the kind of some of the environmental impacts are really unsustainable. We know that government plays a key role in sort of, so the government policies shape a key role in providing the incentives for the kind of investment that goes into agricultural production. But governments also provide a lot of support to agriculture sector, whether directly through subsidies or through other kinds of sort of pricing and fiscal instruments. And in fact, we know that at the moment, governments provide globally over $800 billion a year in support to their agricultural sectors. But unfortunately, a lot of that support is often very inefficient. So very little of that benefit actually goes to farmers. And then some of the incentives that are set up through those support systems are actually driving, inadvertently driving harmful outcomes. So setting up incentives for things like land use conversion, deforestation, overuse of chemicals, and things that are actually ending up in the agriculture sector, contributing to drive climate change, contributes a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions, contributing to land degradation and sort of water contamination and biodiversity loss. And that creates a vicious cycle in turn, whereby farmers experience worse kind of climate and environmental shocks and yield losses, and it has harmful impacts on their production. So we've identified, you know, there's a real need to kind of shift government policies and support so that the incentives and the enabling environment are in place for farmers to be able to farm in a more sustainable manner. And so in order to sort of support that process, there are three things that, well, there's several things that we've been doing through my department. One of those is indeed to support the creation of a just rural transition sort of platform, knowledge hub and community of practice, which I'm happy to say has brought us all together today. Then secondly, together with the World Bank, we co-convene a policy dialogue, to give it its full title, Policy Dialogue to Accelerate Transition to Sustainable Agriculture through Redirecting Public Policies and Support and Scaling Innovation. So we launched this in 2021 under the UK COP26 presidency, using that convening power together with the World Bank to bring governments together to look at sort of policy action and to create a platform for sort of peer-to-peer sharing of experience on what is working to shift support and investment into more sustainable agriculture that delivers results for people, that's nutritious diets and healthy economies, as well as for climate mitigation and adaptation, and for protecting and restoring biodiversity. And it's sort of through this policy dialogue, we've now engaged over 48 countries to date, and governments are sort of sharing experience, but also it also facilitates partnerships and is building, I believe, collective ambition to shift the policy frameworks to support more sustainable investment in agriculture. And then in addition to that, so the policy dialogue involves countries from global north and south, and it's all countries have to make the policy changes that we need to deliver sustainable agriculture and food systems. But we also recognize that in developing countries, often that support is needed for governments to be able to undertake the policy analysis and the consultation processes that will help to kind of shift policy. So we have also developed, we call it a Just Rural Transition Support Program. In collaboration with the World Bank, it's providing support to governments to develop and redesign policy. But we're also working to provide, we're calling it some wraparound support to help with some of the things that I think Irish and Elizabeth mentioned, the need for sort of bottom-up support for farmers' organisations and other stakeholders to be able to engage on a systematic and regular basis in the kind of the consultation processes required to get for an inclusive policy reform process. I wanted to, so I perhaps just sort of be clear in what the policy dialogue is doing. It is focusing on the agriculture sector. So which we think is a sort of a key element of food systems transformation. But let me not pretend that it goes a lot broader than that. So we're using sort of the agriculture entry point. Through the policy dialogue, as I said, you know, we've engaged, many countries have come together and they're sort of sharing experience between peers, sharing really kind of rich experience, I believe, and they're sort of sharing different approaches to engaging stakeholders and on the whole process of policy reform. So in fact, the point of the dialogue is not so much around the science. We're not discussing this, for example, the soil science and so on. We're really discussing the process and what leads to a good process for equitable and inclusive transition. So governments have shared a number of different approaches. As I said, it's a sort of peer-to-peer dialogue, but through the dialogue, we've been able to publish country-authored case studies presenting some of country experience, and we've also shared summaries of the dialogues to date, where governments have sort of shared more publicly some of the experiences they have. I would say there is very much an interest. Governments are very keen to learn from each other on what seems to be working on engagement with stakeholders through different processes, and we're also kind of looking forward to convening multi-stakeholder dialogues in the future. So some of the experiences that have been shared, I would say in some cases, governments take the approach of sort of setting the policy framework and then sort of inviting views and perspectives from farmers. So for example, in New Zealand, experience that they've shared is around the sort of a pricing system that is going to be introduced by 2025 to bring down greenhouse gas emissions in the agriculture sector. And so the government set up a partnership with industry and with the Maori indigenous peoples. I might pronounce this incorrectly, but they set up the He Waka Eke Noa partnership to explore different perspectives on how this pricing mechanism should be introduced. And they received sort of thousands and thousands of sort of pieces of response and recommendations from farmers and from industry, which led them to kind of find out which was the most popular pricing mechanism, and farmers preferred a sort of farm-based pricing mechanism. So that is the recommendation that I believe now sits with Parliament to take forward. So there's that approach of kind of the government setting a policy and then consulting on how to take it forward. In some other cases, so for example, in Canada, they also set a legal framework to reduce emissions in every sector, including in agriculture, but then have invited farmers and other stakeholders to sort of set their own roadmaps to net zero on how they're actually going to achieve those sort of legal obligations. There are other experiences really interesting to learn from, where governments have sort of come together to develop participatory methodologies for setting the policy. So for example, in Vietnam, they told us about partnering with the CGR research centers to help develop a response to climate risk faced by farmers in the rice farmers in the Mekong River Delta, using a participatory methodology that combines traditional knowledge with science-based research, so that has helped to develop mapping of adaptation policy. It's been helping government to kind of target their support better, depending on the local area, and has helped farmers then to reduce their yield loss. And then the other approach, I guess, a little bit more developed, is actually co-design of policy reforms with farmers. And I think Elizabeth provided some really great examples of how that's happening elsewhere in the world. In the UK, the government is trying to develop policy with farmers. And so in the shift from a land use subsidy scheme where farmers were rewarded just on the basis of how much land they held, to environmental land management schemes where the government seeks to reward farmers for environmental outcomes. They've set up a whole sort of test and trial, the consultation test and trial process, whereby they're testing different methodologies of bringing in new incentives for farming that reward environmental outcomes, by sort of trialing that and working it through with farmers. So just to conclude, I think there are very many different approaches that go from kind of inviting feedback on what government has set out to sort of more kind of fully participatory and co-design processes.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. That was super inspiring and very, very interesting listening to you. And it's great to hear, first of all, your peer-to-peer experience. I think this is also something, even as WWF, we do this very often, bringing partners from different parts of the world together. We have done this also with farmers in South America to really learn from each other. You have done this with government. I think this is more than important to have this kind of exchange. So to learn from each other, to improve approaches. And the examples you have mentioned from New Zealand, Canada, and the latest one from UK, where you really integrated the farmers in the policy reforms, I think this is something which is really encouraging. As always, we are running a little bit out of time. I have maybe one question for Irish and Elizabeth, also from your farmer's perspective, and having listening to the examples also from Rachel. Do you feel that there is a right balance between the social and the environmental aspect of just rural transition? And maybe you could also, and this is a little bit our final round, give us your main recommendations to ensuring a sustainable engagement of farmers in the national process. But I think, and listening to you, it's even more to how to bring these processes together. I think at the country level, there are a lot of parallel processes still. There are now the national pathways, there are legal regulations which are discussed, there are the climate national commitments. So what is your approach on this? And you have, let me say, each has not more than 1 or 2 minutes. So who would want to start? Irish, do you want to start to a little bit also? I think it follows a little bit of what Aaron mentioned at the very beginning on this procedure justice. Yeah, do you feel there is a procedure justice already happening?
Yeah, thank you, Martina, and thank you, Rachel, also for sharing what's happening. I think at the conceptual level, responding to your question on the balance, on the environment, on justice. I think at the conceptual level, we can say yes, there is descriptions are there, but really the problem is how do you bring this concept? How do you lies these concepts on the ground, no? And there's always, no, the disconnect. I mean, at the concept, we can connect that, but on the ground level, no, I think the capacity of those who are implementing is not yet there to really link those different concepts. And even though during the, I participated in one of the processes at the CN level on mainstreaming environment in agriculture plans, and I was talking with some technical people, and there was a struggle in even grasping that concept. And how do you really do that, no in designing these programs to have those multiple outcomes for the environment, for the people? So yeah, that's what I can say. Like, there's still a need, even among the program planners, not just the policymakers at the national level, but with the program planners, those who are doing the planning, the budgeting. How do you really operationalize that concept? I think in terms of framework, in terms of global documents, we have it there, but the gap is on the implementation and in the capacity in really, implementing those concepts. So I want to go to your second question, and I think it's more on the recommendation, and I want to be more pragmatic, because we've heard a lot of so many disempowering experiences, and I think Elizabeth has mentioned some of them on the participation, what that truly means, no. So yeah, for me, I just want to emphasize, and it's also like responding to the challenges and recommendation. One of the challenge I want just to highlight is that the coordination at the national level. At the moment, government agencies are still addressing the challenges from their own sectoral mandates. So for us, even, we have to, like the different processes, we have to talk with the people on the doing climate action, engaging in the UNFCCC, and then at the CBD, and then in these national pathways. So for, with the support given to us by FAO through the UN Decade of Family Farming in Bangladesh in the coming weeks, we are now identifying these different people, and we want to bring them together and with our members, with some CSOs who are supporting farmers' organization. And again, I want to emphasize that if we are given that resource, then we are able to strengthen our capacity to be conveners as well. So that's what I wanted to recommend for these national pathways. In Vietnam, for example, there are 3 national conveners, from the research institution, from the government. Then I hope, there should be also one from the civil society, from the farmers' organization, who is part of that national convening team. So I think that's one way that we would like to recommend moving forward. Or if not, we want to approach and introduce ourselves to those national convening teams so we can be part of the process. So I think I want to emphasize also mainstreaming, not just really creating new policies, but strengthening the existing one and mainstreaming the concepts in the existing programs. And I want to just emphasize, to recommend, to call on those who wanted to support farmers' organizations to continue strengthening the social institutions of farmers, fishers, pastoralists, be it the farmers' organization, cooperatives, farmer groups, self-help groups in other countries, because this is the way for us to really, strengthen our engagement with our governments.
Thank you, and thank you for your 3 great recommendations on the coordination at national level. You emphasize the challenges, how difficult it is, and we recently discussed we also need maybe an institutional innovation, because very often the governments needs a different way in being better aligned in this. And also I think it's interesting to hear about the convener and the convener role, and to have maybe, or to have also farmers as a convener. Elizabeth, this is the question also to you from your experience in Uganda and your different roles as the president of EAFF. What do you see the biggest challenges, and also your recommendations on the ongoing, or let's say on the next 2 years for the next stocktake of the UN Food System Summit?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I really agree with all the points that have been, highlighted by Irish. And I also want to point out that the question of having the right balance on social and environmental aspects, and also looking at the policies. When you look at the policies that our countries have, I think, just to be honest, we have the right policies. But what is lacking mostly is the implementation. But also when you look at even all these processes that we are talking about, the UNFSS, for example, the Stocktaking, it's just building on the initiatives that we've been doing at county level and also at other levels. But I think we don't really take time to really evaluate some of these processes. We normally jump from one thing to another before we give enough time to evaluate some of these processes. At times, I really ask myself, from the farmer's perspective, because we really get so much confused at times, because when you look at, for example, what we are talking about, the food systems transformation, how is it different from, for example, the value chain development? How is it different from, when we are talking about climate smart agriculture? How is it different when we are talking about sustainable production management practices and all that? So I think these are just buzzwords, and they're very confusing to the farmer because we don't really package the information very well to be consumed by the farmer. And at the end of it all this discussion we are having in the global dialogues, the implementation of it is on the farm, and it is by the farmer. So if we don't have the farmers to understand some of these concepts and what is required and what they need to do, then I'm so worried that we will spend a lot of time discussing all these in global conferences and all that, but at the end we shall have less impact. Then the other thing that I want to point out is that most of the partners are really still working in silos. We need to break the silos, even at national level. We see, for example, issues of, yesterday I was in a panel where I was discussing issues of water. For example, issues of water is handled by the Ministry of Environment. Issues of climate change handled by Ministry of Environment. But these are essentials when it comes to agriculture and production. So can we have, for example, the ministries of agriculture closely working with the Ministry of Environment, then of course bringing in Ministry of Cooperatives and Trade, because you can't talk about agriculture without talking about trade. So we need to break the silos. We need to bring everyone on board and start working together as a system. And I think that was the whole intention of food systems. So let's walk the talk, not just stopping at just talking. We need to really walk the talk. Then we need to bring everyone on board. I think I've said about that. We need to have the same level of information. Every actor has different information when it comes to some of these buzzwords. So how do we make sure that we try to package the information in the same manner so that everyone has the same level of information? Resources, resources, resources. It's very critical. Most of our countries are struggling with dates. It's not that food systems is not
Elizabeth,
a priority.
We have only 2 minutes. And
so let me close it at this, highlighting the issue of resources and also the importance of building strong partnerships. Thanks, and over.
Elizabeth, that was already more or less a very perfect closing of the discussion today. But I would like to give one short Twitter format to Aaron for the last words in this session. Aaron, what's your recommendation? Very short, 30 seconds.
I've never sent a tweet in my life, so here goes. Look, just to take it back to first principles, very interesting discussion. To take it right back to first principles, farmers are not a homogeneous group. There's so much diversity within that group of farmers. So we need to make sure that all of that diversity is represented when we are engaging, when we are choosing who we are engaging with, from even within at the community level and the national level. So really understanding that. Secondly, there's many more stakeholders in the rural system, in food systems, than farmers that need to be engaged. Informed workers, we're talking about like local communities. And thirdly is we need to have engagement processes that reflect the constraints that different stakeholders have. So women farmers versus men farmers, for instance, engagement needs to be designed in a way that empowers different groups to be able to participate. That's a pretty long tweet, but there you go.
It's okay. So thanks everybody. It was an amazing panel. Thanks to all of you getting your thoughts. We will also capture this a little bit in a short paper. And it would be great to continue to work with you, and have a nice day. Thanks also to the participants in this call. And let's start and continue to get engaged. The journey has just started on a food system transformation, and hope to stay in contact with you over the next years, months. And thanks a lot again from the organizers, from the Just Rural Transition team, from WWF and all the others. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.